So I'm going to focus my remarks on the European side of the Shogun story, and more generally on the encounter between Englishmen and Japan in the late 16th and early 17th centuries from the English point of view. As a British historian, that's what I bring to the table. I'd like to start with a brief sketch of the life of the navigator William Adams, the historical model for the character John Blackthorne. William Adams was a career seaman who was apprenticed young in the profession, which set him up to become a master navigator, which he did. We know almost nothing about his early life except what is contained in his own letters. According to them, for about 12 years, he worked for the Barbary Company, an association of English merchants trading to Morocco. Wanting to test his skill, in 1598, when Dutch trade to Asia was increasingly underway, he obtained the office of main pilot for an expedition intended to reach the Pacific by sailing west through the Strait of Magellan. This was by far the worst and more dangerous route. Of the 5 ships in the expedition, 1 gave up and returned home, 2 were captured, 1 sank in a storm, and just 1, the Liefde, landed in Japan with only a handful of starving survivors. Their arrival was less fraught than in the novel and the TV series, although local people did steal many things from the ship until the daimyo sent soldiers to keep a watch over the goods. The sick Europeans were well treated until a Jesuit said they were pirates, which terrified them so much that 2 of the Dutch treacherously volunteered to give evidence against their compatriots. Presently, as in the novel and the show, Adams was brought to see Ieyasu at Osaka in what he thought was a very fancy gilded house. Just as in the show, Adam explained that he was English and that England desired trade and friendship and that they were at war with Spain and Portugal. He showed Ieyasu a map of the world, which interested him very much. After an uncomfortable 40 days in prison, Adams was reunited with the other survivors and with the ship, which had been brought to Osaka in the meantime, and Ieyasu ordered them to be given money in compensation for the stolen goods. Adams reported that they tried very hard to get their ship back. They sought all means by supplications to get their ship free, spending a lot of the money that Ieyasu had given them, but in vain. Losing confidence in their leaders, the sailors mutinied, and they all ended up dividing their remaining money and going their separate ways. That is pretty much the narrative. About the political drama of this period and all the events leading up to the Battle of Sekigahara, Adams says little or nothing. His letters do mention that in the following years, he built 2 ships for Ieyasu, taught him some mathematics, and was generously rewarded, but was always denied permission to return home. So he stayed in Japan, working as a shipmaster and a merchant, and eventually contacted the English East India Company. In his letters, he did not say that he had married a Japanese woman, not a noblewoman, of course, and had had children with her. But when he died after a prosperous career, he did leave his estate divided between his 2 families, his wife and child in London and his wife and children in Japan. In addition to the scantiness of evidence for Adams's involvement in Ieyasu's rise to power, there is a specific difference between the real William Adams and the fictional John Blackthorne that I'd like to highlight to you. A central conceit of Shogun is that when Blackthorne arrives in Japan, he's full of provincial assumptions about food, bathing, sex, medicine, the superiority of the West, and so on. And these assumptions are challenged as he becomes more and more entangled in personal relationships and politics. So he starts off fresh off the boat, arrogant, indignant, and as he slowly gains a better understanding of the sophistication of Japanese culture, the audience does as well. From a storytelling view, this works beautifully, but Blackthorne's provincialism would not have been shared by the historical William Adams. After all, he had spent a lot of time in Morocco. The Barbary Company is poorly documented. We really don't know that much about its day-to-day pursuits, but we do know that the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur and Queen Elizabeth shared common enemies in Spain and Portugal, and that Moroccan sugar was traded for English cloth, guns, and gunpowder. Adams would have been familiar with Islam, as well as the Jewish traders who were often go-betweens for English merchants on the Moroccan coast. He might have spoken Arabic, as well as Portuguese and Dutch. He would certainly have learned to watch his step and mind his manners and accommodate himself to the unfamiliar practices and customs of a formidable non-European civilization long before ever setting foot in Japan. And Adams's experience with multiple episodes of cultural encounter were normal for Englishmen in Asian waters. In this period, many English ships were active in the Mediterranean, calling at Ottoman and North African ports in addition to European ones. The usual sea route to Asia was around the Cape of Good Hope, and early East India Company ships stopped at places like Sierra Leone, the Cape itself, Madagascar, Mozambique, Socotra, Aden, and Surat before even getting to the Indonesian archipelago. As traders, Englishmen got used to negotiating with powerful foreigners. They were used to speaking foreign languages, respecting local customs, and trying to follow local etiquette. They didn't have much in the way of imperial might going for them, and so cultural chauvinism was a luxury they could not afford. The cultural adaptability and respectful attitude that John Blackthorne demonstrates in Shogun were learned behaviors for Englishmen engaged in cross-cultural trade under dangerous conditions. And now, just to give you a little visual sense of what English cross-cultural engagement was like in this period, I want to show you a few pictures here. The first one here is a portrait of the Moroccan ambassador to Queen Elizabeth, who arrived in 1600. He was there trying to get an English fleet to help Morocco invade Spain. There were friendly talks, but nothing came of it. This is a picture of Matuoka, alias Rebecca, daughter of the powerful Prince Powhatan, Emperor of Virginia. You probably know her better as Pocahontas. Dressed in extremely fancy Elizabethan clothing here, well, early Stuart, I should say. Look, she has an ostrich feather fan, all very fancy. This is a watercolor of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And in the lower left, you can see that the artist has copied in a picture of the English monarch, King James I. But the portrait shows that the emperor is much more interested in a Sufi holy man than in whatever the English king has to say. And finally, here is a John Blackthorne-like character. This is the English adventurer Robert Shirley, who spent a lot of his life in Persia at the court of the Shah. And he was engaged in all kind of, I don't know, I want to say diplomacy. He served as an envoy for the Shah to England. He was involved in all kinds of things, but didn't really come to much. But you see him here in some very, very fancy clothes with his Circassian wife, who is carrying a pistol, I think to show her engagement with Western Europe. Finally, here are some books you can read if you want about this topic. So the cultural sophistication of the English was derived in part from their weakness in terms of raw power. James Clavell, the author of Shogun, tends to read back the naval might of 18th century Britain onto the 16th century. So speaking via Blackthorne, he vastly overstates Elizabethan sea power. The Elizabethan Navy was small, closer to 40 ships than 150, and on average, 1 or 2 ships were built a year, not 20 or 30. The state had no standing army. For the English state to set forth a major naval expedition to project power outside home waters was very difficult and expensive. And so those expeditions almost never happened. And when they did, they typically failed. So when an English armada was sent against Spain in 1589, it was a complete and total disaster, in part because the commanders completely disobeyed their instructions. English government was sophisticated in many ways, but the idea that the Queen had a navy that did what she wanted it to do was an aspiration, not a reality. Clavel gives the impression that English government was a mess at the local level, with city streets filled with filth and criminals, but that it was advanced as a fiscal military state. In fact, I would say the opposite was more true. I do want to give Shogun well-deserved praise, however, for recognizing that in Japan, and indeed in Asia more generally, Europeans competed for the favor of local rulers. In Shogun, the Portuguese accused the men of the Lifta of being pirates, while John Blackthorne tells Toranaga that the Portuguese and the Spanish were intent on taking control of the non-European world. This did actually happen. People did talk this way. And in my work on early modern English global expansion, it's a central theme. To establish productive relationships, English actors had to persuade local rulers that they were inoffensive and worth keeping around. Encountering foreign peoples in trading contexts even prompted the construction of English identity, I argue, because Englishmen were continually obliged to explain themselves to foreign audiences. In short, they performed Englishness for Asian eyes. This could be difficult. Like the Dutch, the English were latecomers in Asian waters, and when they showed up in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they had to work hard to define themselves positively. The English were perpetually being dogged by accusations of piracy. In Japan, according to the Captain John Serres in 1613, our English nation hath been long known by report, but much scandaled by the Portugal Jesuits as pirates and rovers upon the seas. In Surat, an English merchant was disturbed to hear that the Portuguese viceroy at Goa had written to Jahangir very basely of our nation, terming us thieves, disturbers of states, and a people not to be permitted in a commonwealth. And in Persia, the Portuguese told the Shah that the English were not merchants, but thieves and sea robbers. These accusations were a thorn in the side of the early East India Company, not least because there was a lot of truth to them. And the company worked hard to prevent English sea robbers from showing up in Asian waters and making them look bad. But in addition to communicating who English people weren't, they also had to show who they were. The historical William Adams apparently told Ieyasu, "We were a people that sought all friendship with all nations, and to have trade of merchandise in all countries, through which our countries on both sides were enriched." What's not to like? Asked about religion, English travelers typically emphasized that they weren't Catholic, but they downplayed the complex theological commitments of Protestantism. Adams said, vaguely, that he believed in God that made heaven and earth. Elsewhere, Englishmen were careful to show respect for Islam and emphasize commonalities between the two religions of the book. This cannot have been very comfortable for them, but they did it. For the English, distinguishing themselves from the Portuguese was pretty simple compared to distinguishing themselves from the Dutch. Merchants, not missionaries, Christians, but not Catholics, even their spoken language sounded the same. The most salient difference was that the English hailed from an ancient monarchy, while the upstart Dutch had rebelled against their Spanish sovereign, and here the advantage was clearly on the English side. Still, early East India Company agents worried that their rivals were intentionally blurring the lines. At Agra, one lamented that the Jesuits said, "We are a people rebelled subjects to their king, and they make us and the Hollanders as one." In Japan, John Serres claimed that the Dutch had passed generally by the name of Englishmen, presumably to avoid explaining their embarrassingly common origins. At Banton, similarly, there were complaints about the Dutch usurping the English name. It's not clear to me whether the Dutch actually did pretend to be English. In Japan, at least, they seem to have dealt with their political problems by pretending that their stadtholder was a king. But the English worried about it, especially as they didn't want to get blamed for Dutch disorderly conduct. In Banton, for example, fearful of getting a bad name, the members of the English factory made a really big deal about celebrating Queen Elizabeth's accession day. They paraded around the city ostentatiously with scarves in their national colors, telling everyone who asked that they were celebrating because they were English, not Dutch. Indeed, though they were both Protestants, the English people in this period really did think they were different, namely better than the Dutch. Popular English stereotypes held that the Dutch were low-class louts who drank far too much, while they themselves were more courteous, more self-disciplined, and better governed. And these stereotypes, as you will have seen, are very faithfully replicated in the TV series Shogun, where the Dutch survivors of the fictional Erasmus are presented as foils for Blackthorn's moral, physical, and cultural superiority, right? They are drunken louts. I appreciate this because it is so true to early modern English self-perception in this period, but it is a serious deviation from the actual historical narrative. Among the Dutch survivors of the Liefde, one became an advisor to Ieyasu, one engaged in trade as a merchant in Nagasaki for a long career, and another helped to establish Dutch trade in Japan. As I mentioned earlier, when the historical William Adams heard that the English East India Company was active in the East Indies, he was only able to get word to them by smuggling letters to them via an English sailor serving on a Dutch VOC ship. And in general, the early English East India Company struggled to compete with the vastly more powerful Dutch VOC. And as the rivalry slipped into open warfare, many English merchants and sailors were subjected to the coercive power and violence of the VOC, which was a bitter humiliation that their sense of national superiority did nothing to assuage. So in general, while Shogun leaves out the rest of the non-European world, misrepresents Elizabethan England, and treats its Dutch characters poorly so to tell a compelling story, there is a lot to like in its presentation of the cultural dynamics and power imbalances in early Anglo-Japanese encounter. But you might be wondering, what did actual early modern English people think about Japan? William Adams wrote, "They are good of nature, courteous above measure, and valiant in war. Their justice is severely executed without any partiality upon transgressors of the law. They are governed in great civility, I think, no land better governed by civil policy. The people are very superstitious in their religion and are of diverse opinions." Like John Blackthorne, he seems to have liked being in Japan, so much that later English arrivals in 1613 were a little taken aback by his acculturation, finding him to be, quote, "a naturalized Japaner." But they generally liked being in Japan too, at least relative to other places that they visited. When the English ship Clove arrived in 1613, it was met by crowds of men and women who came on board from boats and were curious to see everything. John Serres's records are full of banquets, gift-giving, and musical performances. The view of Japan that emerges from English sources is quite different from that of the miniseries, with its elegantly spare interiors, its meditative rituals, and its silent, self-effacing servants. Instead, it was full of noisy children, crowds of people, festivals, frolics, plays, and prostitutes. Captain Serres's main complaint in his narrative of his trip to Osaka was that they were continually troubled by crowds of boys and idle riffraff who yelled and made so much noise that the Englishmen couldn't hear one another speak. He was very impressed by the density of the population, and he liked the strict justice meted out to thieves, but he didn't think that hygiene was a high point because he had to pass through the stinking, rotting corpses of executed criminals whenever he entered a town. Common sailors also liked Japan a lot, and this was a problem because they did not always perform courteous, well-governed Englishness as well as their superiors would have liked. Captain Saris had a hard time stopping his sailors from straggling on shore, where they got drunk, fought one another, patronized brothels and conjurers, forged relationships with local women, and ran away to Nagasaki. Coming not only from a long sea voyage, but also from a relatively chaste society, sexual liberty was particularly exciting for them. You should understand that English people didn't disapprove of sex in general in this period. According to their ideas about health and medicine, sex in moderation was good for one's health, and female pleasure was considered essential to conception. However, sex produced babies. In 16th century England, rapid population growth was accompanied by inflation, quickly rising poverty, and intense worries about how to manage the ever-increasing poor. Prostitution was illegal, and couples were supposed to achieve financial independence before marriage. Most people married comparatively late, and many were never able to marry at all. And neighbors in this period kept a close watch on unmarried girls for signs of illicit pregnancy. So English sailors came from a society in which their lack of access to women was linked to their subordinate social status, and different sexual norms in Japan allowed them to experience a different kind of masculinity, one that tended to be more reserved to the elite in England. One English sailor was so enthralled by what he saw as Japanese culture that he even tried to convert to paganism, what he called paganism, by shaving his head in the Japanese manner. At a time in which English people generally associated head shaving with slavery, it's hard to imagine a more sincere compliment. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. And thank you, Eleanor, for your wonderful comments. I'm going to focus today on Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, and of course, the model for the character of Toranaga in Shogun and the titular shogun. This is a topic that I immersed myself in to research and write a book called Spectacular Accumulation, which came out in 2016, which was the 400-year anniversary of the death of Tokugawa Ieyasu. And in that book, I explored some of the themes that I'll talk about today. I'm going to start with the importance in this era that is in the field of Japanese history, often called the Unification era, the importance of networks and alliances. And to get into this subject, I need to go back a little bit in history. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543. And this is a significant year in Japanese history for a number of reasons. One is that it is the year that the first Europeans arrived in Japan. So it's interesting, that in this show, Toranaga seems to be utterly surprised, of course, by the arrival of this vessel. But he had only ever lived, or rather the real historical figure of Tokugawa Ieyasu had only ever lived in a Japan that had European visitors in it. So it's a good thing to remember, perhaps, that extends back into the mid-16th century, and is not something new in 1599 or 1600 at the time of this show. The Age of Warring States was an era of civil war and a certain amount of social and political chaos when warlords ruled different regional domains in Japan, and they didn't really acknowledge any central authority. So there was still an emperor in Kyoto, and there was, in theory, a shogun, the military general who was supposed to be in charge of the institution that kept all of these warlords in check. But that institution had been undermined in the late 15th century, and no one really paid attention to it anymore. So there was warfare between warlords, and Ieyasu's upbringing was directly shaped by this Age of Warring States. he, as a young boy, actually as a toddler, was sent to another warlord's castle as a hostage. And he grew up in that castle essentially as a prisoner, although because he was the son himself of a minor warlord, he was respected, he was educated. He certainly didn't grow up in prison. But he grew up away from his family and away from his people, and the kind of slightly, mythological claim that's made about Ieyasu and also about Toranaga, that the thing that they learned in their life was that you can never trust anyone, right? I think that that has its roots in the very real story of him living until the age of 18, essentially as a hostage. He was freed from his condition of being a hostage around the age of 18 when a neighboring warlord, a young man named Oda Nobunaga, defeated the warlord who was keeping him hostage. And he thereafter became an ally of Oda Nobunaga. This was one of many examples in Ieyasu's career of chance, right? He could have grown up in a different part of Japan with different neighbors, and would have had a profoundly different life trajectory. But Oda Nobunaga would go on to become the first warlord to attempt in the 1560s to bring the civil war that had racked Japan for many decades to an end, and to establish a stable regime primarily through profoundly violent acts of warfare. Nobunaga also, though, understood the importance of culture and was an active patron of the arts. And that also was successful and set a tone for the different tools that warlords who wanted to stabilize Japan could use. So Ieyasu's career was very dependent, I think, on his relationship to Nobunaga. He was essentially a junior ally, but an ally of almost equal standing to Nobunaga. And that meant that as Nobunaga's fortunes rose, Ieyasu's fortunes rose as well. He, through serving alongside Nobunaga, became one of the most powerful and wealthiest warlords in Japan over the course of the 16th century. Um, and this growth is accomplished, it should be said very clearly, through network building and the formation of alliances. Warriors do not, samurai warriors in late medieval Japan do not only communicate through battle. In fact, they need to be effective communicators off of the battlefield so that when they ride with their troops into battle, they are well organized, those troops are loyal, the generals who are either their allies or under their command will do as they're told. So there was a tremendous amount of work that was required to form and maintain these alliances. And one of the many practices that I talk about in the book Spectacular Accumulation that we see in Ieyasu's career that allows him and his peers to build and maintain networks and alliances is gift giving. As Eleanor mentioned, elites in Japan frequently gave each other gifts, and it was one of the primary ways that arrivals and departures, in other words, meetings, were ritually organized. There were elaborate seating orders, and the seating order of the different upper ranked warriors would determine who got what kinds of gifts. And they would exchange horses, they would exchange swords, they would exchange Chinese ceramics, they would exchange, in some cases, money. And this was all part of a kind of economics of loyalty, in a sense. So, not loyalty born from the heart, but loyalty in a sense that is bought and paid for. And some of the practices that I want to talk about next are also part of network building and alliance maintenance. So I've already mentioned the word ritual, and warrior society, samurai society in the late 16th century was highly ritualized. And this has many different manifestations. So, for example, we see in the television show, the grisly and I think intentionally almost frightening act of cutting open your belly, of committing seppuku as a ritual death numerous times to the point where it feels almost exaggerated. And I do think there is in the original novel, in Clovel's work, a fetishization of seppuku. But we also find that this is a historically accurate practice that did occur in the late 16th century, especially because these warlords who were trying to unify Japan, first Oda Nobunaga, then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then Tokugawa Ieyasu, were frequently uh, trying to convince a warlord who had been an enemy to become an ally. And if that warlord refuses, he is offered an honorable death, and that usually does in fact mean seppuku. It also is the case that someone who is lost in battle, rather than face the humiliation of having to speak to his enemy who has defeated him, he will retreat into the upper rooms of the castle and commit ritual suicide. So that is one form of ritual that we see in warrior culture a lot in the late 16th century and also in the show. And I think it is used clearly for dramatic effect, somewhat exaggerated, but it comes from a real historical practice. But a very different example of ritual comes from the Battle of Sekigahara. And this is not a well-known tale. It's something that I unearthed in my research that I think is really fascinating. So, in the Battle of Sekigahara, these two huge armies met in central Japan. One army was led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, and it came from the east, so it's called the Eastern Army. And that was essentially the pro-Tokugawa army. The other army, the Western Army, came from Osaka and from the capital region, and it was essentially the anti-Tokugawa army. So these two armies were basically fighting over whether Tokugawa Ieyasu would be the supreme commander of the military forces of Japan, allowing him, if he wanted to request the honor of becoming shogun. And the forces were fairly evenly matched. And in fact, the Western Army, the anti-Tokugawa army, arrived in the valley earlier in the morning and sort of set up their positions to lay a trap for the Tokugawa army, the Eastern Army. But Tokugawa Ieyasu knew something that the commanders on the other side did not, which is that he had convinced two of the main generals in the anti-Tokugawa army to be traitors, to turn sides or change sides and join him. And that would turn the tide of battle. And that is exactly what happened according to the extant primary sources. And it is essentially how Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara and was able to thereafter establish a new military government and become shogun, et cetera, et cetera. But the way that this happened is quite interesting. One of the turncoats was a warrior named Kikkawa Hiroie. He was a vassal of the Mori house of warlords. And he was in the vanguard of the army that he was fighting with. The vanguard means the group of troops at the very front. And the vanguard's job is to lead the troops into battle. And this Mori army was positioned on a hill looking down into the valley of Sekigahara. And when the commander of the anti-Tokugawa army signaled to him, now is the time to attack, he simply didn't move. He wasn't the commander of his army, but he was the vanguard, and he was in the way. And according to the ritual politics of war, if the vanguard didn't move, the main army behind it couldn't move either. So the entire army was locked in place. The commander behind him is yelling and sending signals saying, "What are you doing? We've been called into battle. Move forward." And the commander down on the field is sending the signal, "Attack, attack, attack." But he had pledged his loyalty to Tokugawa Ieyasu secretly, and he used the ritual order of entry as a tool to prevent the army behind him from entering the fray. So it's a very small example of how ritual politics can shape the real outcomes of these samurai conflicts. And I think that's something we see in the show again and again. And it's a reminder that the warlords whose names are famous even in popular culture today, like Tokugawa Ieyasu, were not gods. They were not men who could act out their will on earth without constraint. They lived in a society that had rules. And most of the time, they had to follow those rules. And I think that's something that the show gets right. Ieyasu, or rather Toranaga, is portrayed as being wise beyond years, but even he has to rely on luck. He has to rely on other people. He has to use all the tools at his disposal to have any hope of not being defeated. And I think that's pretty accurate. Another thing I like about the show is that it does, I think, a good job of showing certain cultural practices that are very important in samurai society in the late 16th century, especially in and around the year 1600. One example of this is of course, chanoyu, the culture of ritualized tea, sometimes called the tea ceremony. And we see one tea gathering that's a little bit unusual between the estranged husband and wife pairing that we see on the screen. And Mariko, who in some ways is the star of the whole show, stands up to her husband who's trying to apologize in a way for his behavior. Um, Tea gatherings like this one were very important in samurai politics in the late 16th century and beyond. And often important discussions, important decisions probably did occur in these gatherings. But in theory, the aesthetic of the tea gathering, the kind of vibe, was one of relative silence, the enjoyment of small pleasures, the bubbling, boiling water in the kettle, the sound of water being poured into the tea bowl, the sound of the tea whisk, the bamboo tea whisk on the glaze of the ceramic. And the subtle natural light coming in, as we see here, illuminating the hanging scroll in the tokonoma or alcove. And the idea of a kind of domestic squabble like this unfolding in a tea gathering, I think is a little bit anachronistic. Surely it did happen sometimes. Both men and women participated in tea culture. But this is a dramatic device that the show makes good use of to move the plot forward. It also turns out that Toranaga and Ieyasu were not really fans of the tea ceremony. They preferred the outdoors. And I think this is something the show does a good job of representing. The character of Toranaga in the show and the real historical figure of Ieyasu were absolute fanatics about the practice of falconry or hunting with raptors. And Tokugawa Ieyasu, it turns out, was one of the most enthusiastic falconers in all of pre-modern Japanese history, at least according to the extant documentary evidence. He really does seem to have seen something of himself and of the samurai in these beautiful but vicious predators, these birds, that he had many, many, many falcon handlers who would train these birds and would accompany him on falconry expeditions that he used both as an opportunity to sort of measure the lay of the land, to get a sense for the regions of Japan that he might someday have to ride through in battle or order his troops through in some kind of an invasion of enemy territory, but also for the more kind of plebeian pleasures of hearing the wind in the trees and enjoying the hunt. There is one example after Ieyasu became shogun in 1603 and then stepped down from the post of shogun in 1605 when he appointed his son to the position of shogun, or he arranged for that appointment. Ieyasu spent more and more of his time in his retirement practicing falconry. And I really, when I was reading the accounts of his life, the primary source accounts from the early 17th century, I couldn't believe that on almost every page of the documents, line after line, it just said, his lordship went hunting in the fields with his birds. And then the next day, it would say he caught 3 geese. And then the next day, it would say he caught 10, geese. And line after line after line. This is sort of how he spent his time in his retirement. There's one example in 1612. he had to travel between two urban centers, the city of Nagoya and Sumpu, the castle town where he was retired. And during that voyage, which doesn't really need to take that long, he hunted and caught more than 70 birds because he was taking his time and doing the thing that he really loved. So I appreciate that the show illustrates this and ties it into the rise of Toranaga. He talks about the kind of wisdom and vision of a falcon in a way that I don't think Ieyasu would have said those exact words, but he probably would have agreed with them, or he probably would have appreciated them. Lastly, I want to end by noting that the fundamental drama of the original novel, which really was meant to allow English language readers a doorway into late 16th century Japan, is of course the presence of Europeans on Japanese soil. And here I have to say, the novel, the first version of the miniseries, and this most recent version, I think do a pretty good job of showing the interesting power relations between these European visitors, some of whom are there as missionaries, right? The Jesuits who really want to be able to report back to Rome on the hundreds or thousands of converts that they have managed to make. The merchants who are allied with the Jesuits and who work together with them, but want profit and want trading opportunities. And then occasionally an adventurer, someone who doesn't really fit cleanly into either one of those categories, like William Adams, like Blackthorne, who is essentially traveling the globe to make money, but also to have adventures. And this is Japan's most global pre-modern age. This is an era when there were many missionaries active in Japan. They arrived in the late 1540s and had decades of success before they started to experience some persecution under Ieyasu's predecessor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. They continued in their struggle to find converts, to convince the elites of Japan that Christianity was not a threat into the first few decades of the 17th century before they were finally very firmly kicked out of Japan by Ieyasu's descendants. But during his life, and Ieyasu died in 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu never changed his fundamental position of being open to well-regulated and well-controlled trade with various European powers. And we can see this in some of the material culture that still exists in the shrine, the Toshogu, to the deified version of Ieyasu, Gongen-sama. So here, for example, we see a pair of eyeglasses, European-style eyeglasses that were owned by Tokugawa Ieyasu. Another interesting example is this pencil, which was made in New Spain or Mexico and came on a Spanish galleon. There was trade around the Pacific. And of course, as we heard from Eleanor, Ieyasu, in fact, commissioned ships that he thought would conduct trade for Japan as part of this Pacific trade, going all the way to the Americas, then to the Philippines, and then back to Japan. That didn't end up playing out the way he had imagined, but he was open to it. And then lastly, and perhaps most famously, this incredible clock made in Spain in the late 16th century that is still in the collection of the shrine to Ieyasu. So Ieyasu was in his own way, as Toranaga is in the show, friendly to these European visitors and really interested in getting more entangled with them. And I think it's interesting, maybe we'll see in the second season or the third season or the fourth season of Shogun, why that fell apart. And in the end, it was only the Dutch who lasted as partners with Japan in the early modern era. That's it for me. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.